Okay, you're on.
So most of you understand that I'm at a complete disadvantage tonight. I don't have my sidekick. John is going to do the best he can, but he's not nearly as cute as Paula. He doesn't laugh at my jokes like Paula does. And I can't make fun of him like I make fun of Paula. It wouldn't be nearly as much fun. So also, she didn't get the notes finished before she went to the hospital, and I had to finish them up this afternoon. But we'll take a shot at it anyway. Last week I mentioned that at the beginning of chapter 13, it's really a changed gospel, whereas the first 12 chapters are the book of signs that John records, they are to lead people to faith. Jesus has contact with outsiders. He talks to the crowds. He talks to the religious leaders. But that changes in chapter 13. Except for the trial of Jesus, really, he only speaks with his disciples from chapter 13 on. And last week we noticed that when no one else would show enough humility to wash the feet of the disciples, Jesus did. Do you understand what No, you don't understand, but you will. You will, he promises. And then, at the end of that section, we talked about this just for a few minutes, he says, now that you know these things, you'll be blessed if you what? Do them. Do them. It's not just a nice story. Jesus says, as I have washed your feet, you need to wash one another's feet. As I have been willing to serve you, you need to have a heart that is willing to serve one another. And that was a mantra that I think shaped the form of the early church, not just the apostolic band, but the early church in Jerusalem. And as the gospel spread into the Gentile world, people came to understand this is the kind of heart that Jesus is looking for. Not one that is filled with pride, but one that is willing to empty himself as Jesus emptied himself and served. So now, there's a few things in the rest of the chapter. I'm not going to go through, well, I am going to mention some specific verses. But I want us to try to get a sense of what it was like on that night in the upper room at the Passover meal when the Lord's Supper was established, even though John does not mention it. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all do, and they say it is in the context of this meal. You'll have to ask John someday why he decided not to include it, but there are a lot of things he didn't include. But I want us to at least look at some of the conversation that took place in the upper room. I thought about doing this. I'm not going to, so don't panic. I thought about turning out all the lights. Because the room that night would have been quite dark. Those new advanced bulbs had not yet been. They didn't even have kerosene lamps like I used to see at my aunt's house when we'd go to the farm. They would have a wick laying in a bowl of oil, and they would light it, and it would burn, glow, whatever you want. There might be 3 or 4 of them, but it's nighttime. The sun has gone completely down, and they're in a room that is mostly dark. And you can see how the shadows would flicker against the walls. And I'm reminding you of that because of the things that are said in this chapter. I think they take on a greater depth of meaning if you can imagine that kind of room rather than this kind of room. Or if you can imagine this kind of room in the Bible as compared to Leonardo da Vinci's room. Now, I'm sure Leonardo da Vinci was a great painter. There's no doubt of that. But that painting of the Last Supper, It looks like the table was bought from Ashley's Furniture and the tablecloth from Bed Bath & Beyond. You know what I mean? That is not anything like the Last Supper would have looked. Not anything. They didn't have a table like that table. There was no tablecloth. Not all the disciples sat on one side of the table. You know, that almost looks like Jesus said, hey guys, if you want to be in the picture, get on this side of the table. You know. And they all went, okay. And I don't even hold it against Da Vinci that he painted John to look so effeminate that they claim it's Mary Magdalene. I've read the book, you know what I mean? But anyway, it's not anything like that. And I'm going to try to give you a better idea. I don't imagine this to be completely accurate, but I think it's better. This should probably be shorter, but that's all right. I messed up now. Okay. So this would be the table, and it would probably be somewhere around a foot off the ground, 18 inches maybe. And they could spread pillows here around. Because people didn't sit. I know some of you know this so well, but it's important. And people, rather than sitting at the table, would recline at the table. They would lean on the pillows on their left arm so that their right arm was free to eat with. And so if you can imagine, bodies going out like this because they're leaning on their left arm and their right arm is free. Is that okay? I'm not going to get 12, but you understand, okay? So it's like, is it like this? Anyway. So here are the disciples reclining at table, and it's a solemn night, not only because it's the Passover meal, but Jesus has been saying things to the disciples which clearly demonstrate that something is up. The disciples don't really understand what it is, but Jesus keeps talking about, well, now's the time. The hour has come, Jesus said. And I don't think any one of the 12 knew any more than, whoa, this must be important. This is something big. So they're reclining here at the table, and it's during this time, and I'm going to suggest to you something here that I hope that will be demonstrated from the text. I think this is Jesus, the host, here in the center of the table. Do you remember what the mother of the sons of Zebedee asked Jesus for? I would like for my boys, James and John, the author of this book, to sit at your right hand and at your left hand. And both of those positions were very prestigious, important positions. But if you had to pick one, which one was more prestigious, believe it or not, it was the one on the left. And I believe that John is sitting here. And I believe that Judas is, I say sitting, reclining there. And I think there's proof of that. Not absolute proof, but definite indication in the story that must have been the way it was. And I hate that he only looks like squiggly here, but this is probably Peter down here. I don't know where he was, but he wasn't at the head table. That comes out in the story too. People may have said, he talks so much, put him down at the end where we don't have to hear it. And so, during that night, not only is there a a remembrance of the past in terms of the Passover, but there's also an eye to the future where Jesus says, this is my body, do this in remembrance of me. This is the blood of the new covenant, the going forward covenant, you know. And they're going, what? But that adds to the solemnity of what is going on. Now, Jesus had mentioned more than once in the Gospels that one of the disciples was not what he appeared to be. Do you remember any allusions to that in John? And even when he washed the disciples' feet earlier in the earlier in the chapter is what I'm trying to say, he said, no, you're all clean. Oh, wait, not all of you. Not all of you are clean. And there's no record of anybody saying, could you please explain what that means? They all went. And then you come to chapter 18, where Jesus says specifically, I'm not referring to all of you. I know those who I've chosen. But this is to fill the scripture, he who shares my bread has lifted up his heel against me. Now originally, 1,000 years before that, it was David bemoaning the fact that someone who he had trusted had turned against him. Jesus takes that verse from the Psalms and he applies it to his own situation. Just as David had someone lift his heel against him, a close friend, I've got a close friend. I've got someone that we've shared meals with many, many times. And he is going to do something awful. Jesus shares that. And then he says in verse 19, and you have to read this a couple of times to say, what? He says, I'm telling you now before it happens, so that when it does happen, you will believe that I am he. Here's what I think that means. If word got out that Judas caught Jesus by surprise, then really this was not how Jesus expected to end his life. But in telling the disciples, look, when I am led away to be crucified, remember I told you there was a guy in our group that was going to be responsible for doing this. I even knew that. So when you remember that I knew that, you will remember that, yes, I am the one that I claimed to be. Otherwise, how would I have possibly known that Judas was going to be like that, or that Judas was going to betray me like that? And then verse 21 is a troubling verse. It says, after he had said this, Jesus was troubled in spirit. I even put the Greek word in the notes for you. I don't know why. I hope it's not just so I can show you I know stuff. It's tarasso. And it's a very strong word. I mean, it means someone who is extremely agitated. Not angry, but troubled. And this word applies to Jesus only on two other occasions. I think I put them for you in the notes. One is when he was standing at the grave of Lazarus, and Mary said, Lord, if you'd been here, Mary said, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. And when Jesus saw her weeping, and all of the Jews who had come by, they were weeping, he was tarassoed. It tore him up to see what once was this great happy creation had become a place where people, their spirits were ripped apart because of the death and the separation and the sorrow. That bothered Jesus. And then the only other time is in chapter 12 and verse 27. I could read that to you, I suppose. Now my heart is troubled. And what shall I say? Save me from this hour? No, it's this very reason I came to this hour. And clearly what's troubling him in that verse is the fact that he knows this hour is upon him. And I know we've got quite a few chapters till we get there, several Wednesday nights, but Jesus is less than 12 hours away from dying in all likelihood. And he said, my heart is tarasso, it is torn up. To see the people mourning in chapter 11, to feel the imminent horrific death in chapter 12. And now in chapter 13, when he's reminded of one of his own disciples is going to turn him in. He is very, very troubled in spirit. Now, in your notes I mentioned that it seems remarkable to me, I don't know if it does to you, but it seems remarkable to me that when Jesus says that in the group, no one has any idea who he's talking about. In fact, in the other synoptics, I cheat sometimes, Patty, and go to the synoptics. It's like they go around the room. Is it I? And some of them were Galileans, and they said, is it me? See, that's bad grammar, you see, yeah. But it's translated, of course, is it I? And in the sense that the disciples, I don't think they were just being strange. I think they were thinking that the betrayal was somehow in the future quite a ways. Am I going to turn into that kind of person? Is it me? No. Is it I? I'm from Galilee too. I should have mentioned that. They don't have any idea who it is. And I mentioned that when Jesus washed the disciples' feet, apparently he didn't give any indication in the way he washed Judas's feet that he was the betrayer. Now, for the first time in John's Gospel, we read the phrase, the disciple whom Jesus loved. If you were here for the introduction, I suggested to you that the evidence from within the gospel and from the testimony of those who referred to the gospel in the first and the second and the third centuries, they were all unanimous. John is the author of this book, but he never identifies himself as the author of this book. In fact, we almost have to presume that he is the disciple whom Jesus loved. The only other time that I know of in the New Testament where that phrase is used to describe a disciple or friend of Jesus, do you remember, for a gold star? Well, you don't get a gold star, but it's okay. You don't need one to go to heaven. In John chapter 11, when Lazarus took a turn for the worse, his sisters sent word to Jesus, who was across the Jordan, a long way away. And this was the message. Do you remember? Lord, the one whom you love is sick. Apparently Jesus had a relationship, a close relationship with Lazarus. I mean, I mentioned that. Of course, Jesus loved them all. But just like preachers and rabbis today, you develop relationships which are particularly close. And apparently he had a close bond with Lazarus, and he had a close bond with John, which I find interesting in light of the fact that John lobbied for position as well as his mother. And Jesus found a way to love him anyway. Thank you, Jesus. Sometimes our attitudes are pretty bad, and I wonder sometimes, does Jesus? Yes, he can do that. He had a special place in his heart for John. And that comes out in the story because when he announces that there's a betrayer in the room and they have no idea who it is, and as they go around the room and I wonder if Judas said, is it I? I assume he did. But nobody got an answer. So, Peter, down here at the end of, well, he could have been. But he doesn't feel like he can talk to Jesus. He's too far away. But him and John are buddies. And he goes, well, sure he did. John goes, oh, Lord. And you see, here's Jesus' head. I'm sorry for Jesus' head being so bad. And this is John. And John can just see, he's leaning close to him. And he leans his head back over on the breast of Jesus. And he said, would you mind telling me who it is? And by the way, you could say that Peter was curious. But in two other places in the gospel, you found out that Peter was armed. Remember that? Yeah. Peter said, I have a sword. And in the Garden of Gethsemane, he said, want to see my sword? And he cut off the servant's ear. And I think, I don't know, it doesn't say in the text, that Peter says, you know, if I could find out who it was, we could probably take care of that. But I can't ask him. John, you ask him. So he says, well, it's the one that I give. And the Greek word's an interesting word. It essentially means morsel. It could be a morsel of nearly anything. In the old translations, it's called sop. Have you ever read that word? He took the sop. When I was a kid, I studied the King James, and I thought, I hope my mother never served sop. It just doesn't sound like something I would enjoy. But he took a morsel of something and probably dipped it either in some kind of meaty stew from the lamb or the bitter herbs or whatever, and now he can lean. And he hands it to Judas. Now what John never tells us is, did you understand that that meant that Judas was the betrayer? Because he doesn't jump up and say, I found out who it is, this guy. Nothing. Nothing. It's the one that I give this to. And you don't have to buy this, but I would suggest to you that not only is Jesus designating who the betrayer is, but I think he is reaching out to Judas one last time. Judas, I'm giving you the seat of honor here. And when Jesus dips that and hands it to John, normally that is a demonstration of intimacy and of friendship and of saying, this guy is special. I gave him the dip. Unfortunately, that didn't change anything. Now, I'm going to talk about, here's my books. Am I going to, yeah, I'm going to read this in a minute. And, oh, please be the notes that, no, I put them in here. Not to panic. Nobody was panicking, Don, just you. Oh, I think I did. You are such a bonehead. You see, where's my wife? Where's Paula? Boy, that bugs me. I was going to read something, and it's not in there. I had it folded. One moment, please. Okay, I had it folded, and I thought I put it in my Bible, and apparently I didn't, so not to panic. Well, hey, class will be 5 minutes shorter because I'm not going to read those things. things that troubled me when I was a kid, no, an older kid, and in my teenage years, and I don't know if it ever bothered you, because I often hear Judas being talked about as a guy who was chosen to be the betrayer. Now, I'm going to talk about something that is a little iffy. Not everybody agrees with me. In fact, Sid, I hope you will. That way I'd have one. It never did seem fair to me that if Judas was chosen to betray Christ and all he did was to fulfill his part in that master plan, why could he be held accountable? Why? I had this view of God that suggests that in many ways he is fair. Not with people like you and me. We don't want him to be fair with us. We want him to be gracious with us. And so I have this view of God who is at best gracious and at worst at least fair. Why would a guy who would be put in a position where he had no choice, why would he be held accountable? Well, that's when I read this from Ray Stedman's notes. Oh, you don't have Ray Stedman's notes? That figures. And no, I won't read them next week because it'll be too late. But I want to suggest to you, and I think I put this in your notes. Hang on. Yeah. I suggested a series of events that might take place that would cause Judas, who was called like the other 11 to be a disciple of Jesus, to find himself in this unenviable position. And I said, he may have been one of those guys who was a passionate nationalist. Do you remember the group of passionate nationalists in the New Testament? They had a name. You remember their name? Some of you, I bet you Nancy knows, and she won't say it out loud. It starts with a Z and rhymes with Ellet. Zealots, yes. The Zealots. They were nationalists to the point that, I'm told, that they always carried a knife under their robes, and if they ever caught a Roman official by himself, they would kill him. Because getting rid of the Romans was the only thing that mattered. Now, let's say that Judas had some of those leanings. And now, rumor begins to spread among some people that the Messiah has come. Finally, the Messiah has come. The long-awaited deliverer of Israel, he has come. Do you remember in the early chapters we looked at, one guy gets told, hey, we found the Messiah. Where's he from? Nazareth. Yeah, right. The Messiah's from Nazareth. You might as well say he came from Wylie. I mean, I have a son that lives in Wylie. It's okay. It's okay. But Nazareth had such a bad reputation. He can't come from that. But some people said, no, listen, he is. Come and see for yourself. And sure enough, there's this band that forms, and Judas, maybe being caught up in the possibilities that this indeed was finally the Messiah, decided he wanted to enjoy the possibilities that Jesus brought with him. Now, the longer he was with Jesus, I believe, the more frustrated he became. Because for all of their expectations of what Jesus might do next, he never did those things. Do you remember in John 6 when when that multitude gathered and Jesus fed them all with a lunch? You remember? What's interesting is that people were so impressed by that miracle It says they came to make him king by force. And I'll bet you Judas went, I'm on board. Do you remember what Jesus did? Withdrew. The text says Jesus withdrew. That means he said, excuse me, and he went off by himself. This talk of making him king, no. That won't work. And I wouldn't be surprised if Judas kind of went, I think I put my hopes in the wrong place. And interestingly enough, it's just about that point that John in the story begins to say some negative things about Jesus. And I don't know how long he was treasurer, but I think he was treasurer because he was talented and trusted. That's why they made him treasurer. He was talented, he was trusted, he was a guy you could count on, and I think somewhere along the line he started, if this isn't going to be what I thought it was, then at least I can make a few bucks on the deal. And he began to pilfer. Take money from the money bag. Set it aside for his own use. It was no longer something to buy food for the disciples. Yeah, we could do some of that, but it's more important that it goes right here. And in that process, you can see a definite change in Judas. And in chapter 12, you have this amazing story of an outpouring of love and of adoration when the woman brings the alabaster jar and she breaks it. You remember that? And it says the house was filled with the aroma of that. She breaks it on Jesus. And Judas said, that oil could have been sold for a bunch of cash. And that money could have been used to feed the poor. And John says, by the way, he didn't care squat about the poor. Now that's hindsight. I don't think the word squat is in the Greek, he didn't care about the poor. Rather, John says, we came to learn that he was actually pilfering money out of the money bag, and he saw that as a waste of money he could have taken. And it's shortly after, and by the way, Jesus said, hey, back off, Jack. That was his short form of Judas. You leave that woman alone. She has anointed my body for, you remember? Burial. And Judas is going, great. A Messiah who's looking to be buried. And I think that Judas becomes completely disillusioned with the whole idea of Jesus' Messiahship. And maybe he thinks, and I think the plot begins in his mind for quite a while. Well, maybe I can get some money out of this after all. And he goes and makes a deal with the religious leaders. How much you give me if I turn him over to you? If I find a way where you can get him away from the crowds and arrest him, what'll you give me? And they said, how does 30 pieces of silver sound? And he said, well, I was hoping for 50, but I'll take 30. This is Swindoll. It's not Stedman that I really want. Anyway. Listen to this. I think it's good. Secret sin inevitably warps the mind, and twists one's values. Embezzlers like Judas rarely steal much at first, but as the pilfering becomes habitual and then ritualized, the thief must learn to rationalize his sin or face the awful prospect of repentance. Driven by shame, he must keep this sin a secret. Meanwhile, the cycle of compulsion and shame drives a wedge between his private thoughts and a fastidiously maintained public and often pious persona. he still looked good to the other 12, the other 11. Eventually, the sinner accepts his public facade as his true self in a desperate attempt to escape the relentless pursuit of shame. And when caught in sin, an embezzler almost always appears shocked. And in some ways, he is surprised by the accusations because, listen, he has convinced himself that no one can see the true person he had long ago concealed. And in this case, Judas was kind of right. Nobody could. I wrote something in your notes that, if I can find it, I want to point out to you. Come on. You see, where is Paul? Oh, there it is. This is my belief about Judas, and not everybody's going to agree with this. It's okay. God didn't design the treachery, but worked the treachery into his design. God didn't design the treachery, but worked the treachery into his design. You know, Matthew tells us, and Acts tells us too, that a little later, Judas was filled with remorse. You remember that? He brought the money back and said, I don't want this money. And they said, well, we don't want it either. And the reason why he made that decision is because he realized what an awful thing he had done, that he had made a horrible choice. And I've always believed that for Judas, it was a choice. It wasn't something that he had to do. And that wonderful reading from Stedman suggests that God could have found another way to work out his plan. How often did God have something going on and somebody, did this or that and he went, okay, well, let's try this. I find that in the Bible a number of times. I don't know how God would have worked it out, but I'm absolutely convinced that he could have worked it out another way. And here's the part some of you are not going to like. This is from Berge, and he's pretty smart. Judas is a parable and a warning. We read his story as insiders, thinking that it depicts someone else. But Judas is a more disturbing figure than Pilate or Caiaphas or any of the Jewish leaders. He saw the light, and he understood it. But he chose the darkness anyway. Judas is the reminder that every day, in a sense, is Judgment Day, that on any day, some faithful follower like Judas, or like you and me, might turn tail on the light and stumble out into the darkness, caught up in evil or caught up by evil's prince. Paul refers to one of the disciples in 2 Timothy, I think, as someone who did this or that and made shipwreck of the faith. Do you remember that expression? He made shipwreck of the faith. Well, Judas made shipwreck of his apostleship. And it's a very, very sad thing. At the end of this story, Jesus says to Judas, and that's why, see, he can say something to Judas that nobody else can hear, because he's right here. It says, verse 27, that at that point, that Satan entered into Judas. And by the way, in one of those readings, it says, Judas could have kept him out if he wanted to, but he didn't. He used Satan's impulse to do the thing that, and Jesus says, if that's what you're going to do it what? Quickly. Get her done. And it's the only time I know where Satan and God tell someone to do the same thing. God knows it has to be quick. It's not going to be long. Go ahead and do it. And Judas went out. And when he went out, the disciples said, "Aha! That must be the betrayer." Now, some of you are looking in your Bible. I didn't remember reading that. Let me check. No. John says they just thought that Judas, because he was the treasurer, was going out to buy stuff for the feast. Yes, this is the Passover meal, but it's an 8-day feast. And besides that, on this night, it's the only night of the year when the temple gates were left open at night because they wanted people to come in and make gifts. And Judas had the money bag. Maybe he's going to make a donation. Maybe he's going to buy supplies. But it never occurred to anyone, the guy who had just received the morsel was going out to betray his Lord. They didn't know. And by the way, I don't think this is making too much of this. Do you see the last little phrase in verse 30? After Judas had taken the bread, he went out. What does John say? And it was night. And it was night. And in the notes, I tell you, I think that means a lot more than the sun had gone down. Because all through John's gospel, there is this contrast between light and darkness. Who are the children of light and who are the children of darkness? Jesus says in 9:4, chapter 9, verse 4, "As long as it is day, we must do the work of him who sent me, because night is coming, when no one can work. And while I am in the world, I am the light of the world." And then he says in 11:9, "A man who walks by day will not stumble, for he sees by the world's light. It is when he walks at night that he stumbles, for he has no light." And one final one, in chapter 3 and verse 19, perhaps the most telling. It's right at the beginning of the gospel. This is the verdict. Listen, this is the verdict. Light has come into the world, but men love darkness instead of light because their deeds are evil. Light has come into the world, but men love darkness rather than night because their deeds were evil. And when John says, oh yeah, it was night, because Judas is the son of the night. He is the son of darkness. And I'm going to cheat just this one time. In Luke's gospel, when Jesus is arrested in Gethsemane, he says to those arresting him, listen, it's telling, this is your hour when darkness reigns. He doesn't say this is your hour because it's dark. He says this is your hour when darkness reigns. Darkness has trying to overcome the light, and for a while it seems to, until that Sunday morning later. This is your hour when darkness reigns. Jesus then takes up again the topic of being glorified. I'm almost done. I spent a little more time on Judas than I expected, even without the readings. But he begins to talk about being glorified. God is going to be glorified in me, and I'm going to glorify God, and God's going to do it at once. At once. In other words, whatever this glorification is, it's right around the corner. You remember in the prologue when you tried to memorize it? We have seen his glory, John says. The glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father's side, full of grace and truth. We have seen his glory, but he doesn't say what it is. Now, there are probably different manifestations of his glory in the Gospels. I think when he was on the Mount of Transfiguration and his face shone like the sun, that was pretty special. But in John's Gospel, The real glorification is not in some kind of high mountain experience. It's in the cross. This is where Jesus is glorified. This is where God is glorified. Because there is no act that Jesus ever did that shows his love for all of us more than the cross. And that is the glory of God, the love that he has for us. It was he who worked out with Jesus for him to come so that the price could be paid. You remember I just mentioned Isaiah 53 here. It says, we all like sheep have gone astray. We've turned to our own way. But what? The Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. That is the main thrust of God's glory in John. Not some kind of great dazzling miracle, but the humiliation of the cross. And when I say humiliation, there was no greater humiliation in the first century than to be crucified. I mean, not beyond just the fact that it was unbelievably painful, a horrific way to die, but the Romans only crucified the very worst of society. I mean, an embezzler might get whipped, but he's not going to get crucified. The worst get crucified, and they put Jesus up there and put a note over his head that was basically to make fun of him, but it was true. Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. And if you could have seen in parentheses, ha, ha, ha. They thought that was so funny. They even said things to him like, oh, well, he saved others. Let's see how he'll do it, saving himself. It was humiliating. And to increase the humiliation, in all likelihood, they crucified him naked as the day he was born. In the paintings, he always has a nice loincloth. But in all likelihood, he didn't have one on the cross. The Romans wanted to bring as much humiliation as possible. And yet, John says, that's his glory. That's his glory. Your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus, Philippians 2, who being in the very form of God did not count equality with God something to be grasped, but he emptied himself. He took on human nature, being found in the appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even death on a cross. That's really what it means in John's gospel to be glorified. He addresses them as little children. It's the only time they ever find it in John's gospel. You find it 7 times in 1 John, but only once in John's gospel. Now, I have one other thing to talk about. Paula said, you better include this. Thank you. She'll see the video.
Twice.
Hang on. You know, Paula normally marks these things for me. No, she doesn't. I made that up. But it's when he talks about the importance of loving each other. Where is that? 34? Bless you, my child. A new commandment I give you. Love one another. Well, wait a minute. I've told some of you this before, maybe all of you, but when Paula and I pray, and we did today before her surgery, at the end of our prayer, we recite the Shema, the Jewish Shema. I guess that means we're no longer Christians. I don't even know. You remember the Shema? It was something. Shema is the word from which the verse starts in Hebrew, and that's why it's called that. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one God. And you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your mind, and with all of your strength. And next, and love your neighbor as yourself. So it was always God's intention that his people should be loving. Of course, there grew debate about who was the neighbor and who wasn't. Do you remember? That's how the story of the Good Samaritan came up. And the question was, well, now, which one was neighbor? Well, I guess, the guy that helped, the only I can think of. Love your neighbor as yourself. But Jesus says, I'm giving you a new command. Love one another. Oh, wait, he adds something to that. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. And I wish he hadn't said this, but he did. All men will know that you're my disciples if you love one another. You know, people have different ways of trying to demonstrate to the world that they're Christian people, Some have bumper stickers. Some have the little fish emblem, and even Fancy has the cross of it, on the back. Well, that's fine. Jesus said you probably wouldn't have to rely so much on bumper stickers if you just learn to love each other like I have loved you. Now listen, you'll understand this. I don't mind loving you as you love me. As long as you love me and are really nice to me, I'm good at loving you. No. Jesus says, love one another as I have loved you. I have demonstrated to you what love is supposed to look like. And maybe between the lines he said, and by the way, did you notice how I loved Judas? Then you need to love one another as I have loved you. That's the new part of the commandment. That our love for each other is supposed to be like Jesus loves us. Oh my goodness. He will go on in chapter 15, and you know this verse. Greater love has no man than this, than a man do what? Lay down his life for his friends. And Jesus says that to them hours before he is just about to do that. And then he says, that's how I want you to love each other. Now, in my experience, we haven't always been really good at that. I have seen churches split because they couldn't agree on the color of the new carpet. You know I'm not making that up, right? Yeah. Or where we're going to build the new building. I understand that human emotions get involved in stuff, but I'll tell you, sometimes we care a lot more about what the carpet's going to look like than looking like the people of Christ. As individuals and as churches, we just sometimes lose sight of the fact that what Jesus says was going to be a demonstration of the world, that we really did belong to him, is the way we acted toward one another. By the way, a couple of days ago, I saw a bumper sticker on a minivan. It says, honk if a kid falls out, which I had never seen before. I thought that was a very inventive bumper sticker. I'm glad I didn't have to honk, but that's what it said. Obviously, a family of lots of kids. I said one more idea, but then I lied. Because Peter, Jesus says, I'm about to be out of here. I'm about to go away. And Peter, like a second grade kid, goes, oh, where are you going? And I admire Jesus' patience, because if it had been me, I said, Peter, I've been telling you for 3 years where I'm going. I'm going to the cross. I'm going to the grave. I'm going to the Father. That's where I'm going. All he says is, Peter, where I'm going, you can't come. Well, that's crazy. I'd follow you anywhere. I mean, I'd do anything. I'd lay down my life for you, Lord. You know me. And Jesus says, paraphrase, really? You do that, huh? I got news for you, Peter. Before the rooster crows, you'll deny 3 times that you even know me. How did that happen? And what must have been embarrassing is that we're still in this upper room mode. I'm sure when Peter jumped up and down and said, you know, this and this and this, and when Jesus said that, he probably said that to him in the presence of the other 10 disciples. You'll deny 3 times that you even know me. And of course, we'll see, the temptation for Peter came in a way that he never expected. He was ready in the garden. He's got his sword out swinging it. He's ready for anything. But he's not ready beside the campfire when the little slave girl says, say, aren't you one of them? Aren't you one of the guys that belongs to him? The guy that they're beating half to death over there? Peter goes, no. No. 3 times. One of them was kind of embarrassing. They said, you even talk like a Galilean. Well, I'm working on it. Your speech betrays you. We know that you're one of his bunch. No, I'm not. As a matter of fact, Dad's blasted. No telling what he said. I don't. And then the rooster crowed, and Peter went, oh, good. Sometimes we're pretty staunch against temptation, but then it sneaks up on us. Wouldn't it be great if the devil would announce what he is going to do to try to make us fold our tents? Wouldn't that be? But he doesn't do that. He just comes in with a, oh, by the way. And Peter denied he ever knew Jesus. Okay. I plan to cover all of chapter 14 next time, and I will probably just discuss some of the major ideas. Some of you have been waiting for me to talk about the Holy Spirit that Jesus starts talking about in chapter 14. I'll do a bad job, but I'll talk about that. Let you know what I believe. Please don't tell Ray Stedman that I forgot his material to read.